So we're moving on to our next panel. It's called Reducing Risk and Increasing Resilience with Environmental Monitoring Data Solutions. We will be discussing reducing risk and increasing resilience. I just said those words. In the face of extreme weather conditions, climatic changes, and sea level rise. This panel includes a mix of speakers from industry and from academia. Again, I'll introduce our panelists. You will get to hear from each of them, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end if they don't run over their time. First up, I'm going to have Dr. Clarissa Anderson, Executive Director of SCCOOS. Come on up, and I'll see if I can get the talks.
Given them in Google Slides. Do you want to?
He's got them in folders.
Okay.
That bottom up.
Yeah. I don't have my glasses on. This could be disastrous. I should probably get them.
You want to get them?
Yeah. Yeah, so there we are in Puerto Rico last week. Carl, are you in any of those photos? No, you're not, unfortunately. But this is just a nice way to show you a little bit of who we are as a network and that we are a close-knit group. But I'm going to dive into how our organization, SCCOOS, works to increase resilience, reduce risk, et cetera, across a range of sectors and needs that we have in the community. I'll start with this slide, which shows who we are. We are really a small group. I know, there's a lot of people on this upper panel, but kind of on the day-to-day, in terms of the operations of the office at SCCOOS, I really want to say it's myself and Megan. So I have to acknowledge her because my right-hand woman here just does the yeoman's job of so much at SCCOOS. It's great to have her here. Thank you, Megan. You don't get enough accolades. So, but we do have a huge team that makes everything happen. And I don't want to, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that we support an incredible breadth of researchers and folks that cross academia, industry, a number of sectors. And we have other folks who really help us think through how we use the money, like the two in the upper right here. And the reason I bring that up is I want it to be clear that we're kind of a consortium of scientists and oceanographers in the region who come together, take the funding that comes to us from the USIS program, and then decide how to best use it to meet the needs of the stakeholder community. It might not be obvious, but we have these a very elaborate kind of governance structure in order to do that. So as director, I'm not making decisions as an autocracy and just deciding who should do what. We really do all come together as a community through a number of different networks to decide how to do this and how to meet those needs. And as you already heard from Carl, there is this integrated network. There's 11 of us. We're all unique snowflakes, as Carl can attest. We all have our needs, our regional needs, but we're also really different structurally. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but it does matter for kind of how we approach the needs of our local communities. We here, as you know, are at Scripps. We're part of UC San Diego. Some of the other groups are also very academically anchored. For instance, NANUS is a big part of University of Washington system. Some of us are nonprofits. Some of us are hybrid nonprofit academics. And so we're not federal, we're not part of the federal structure per se. We are part of this grander IUS enterprise, and we all approach things a little bit differently. At SCCOOS, it's really quite an honor to be part of Scripps because this broadens our reach into a lot of different places and how we engage with the academic community to do all the things that you're seeing here, ocean observing, data management. This really is an end-to-end system of putting instruments in the water, doing the engineering, pulling those data in real time and sending them off to all the different repositories where they need to go. Some of those are places where data go to die. Some of those are places where data goes to really live on in products and services that we develop, and the outreach and the education, which I don't have a huge amount of time to go into today because I want to give you a nice holistic overview of what we are as a system. California is lucky to have 2 of these regional associations, and that because we are such a big state with so many needs. We're the only such state in the union that has that. SCCOOS is in the north. They're the SCCOOS of the north. And they are stands for Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System. Even I can't say them. It's ridiculous. But you can see what we have going on. And a lot of this is kind of obscured at the scales at which this map is drawn by the Cal Coffee lines, because we do collaborate so strongly with Cal Coffee, and a number of our operational gliders run on those lines 24/7 through the California Underwater Glider Network. But along the shore, and really as you get into those scales that most of our global ocean observing system cannot get to, we're doing a ton of work near shore with moorings, buoys, real-time sensors at pretty much all the municipal and even private piers in California, a lot of models. We have a little picture, graphical illustration of what this looks like just for Southern California. I won't touch on all of these, but you can imagine if you're just thinking about something like essential ocean variables, there's a lot of them coming out of this. We set up our website to have multiple access points depending on whether you're a modeler and you just need all of the sea surface temperature in our network, or if you really need to know something about a specific question or a specific project. But we are really trying to move from the origin of SCCOOS, which is physics, things like radar, gliders, and push that boundary on the ecosystem predictability that is inherent in a lot of the measurements that we make. If we can co-locate the biology and the biogeochemistry at all of these sites where we have physical measurements, we can start to, I think, get to a place where we meet a lot of different societal needs and think about resilience in an extremely broad way, broader than what we're doing now. And to do that, we have an incredible network of stakeholders and partners. This does look like a lot, but all of these groups have written letters of support for us, for our funding. We try to engage with them as much as is humanly possible, with just two of us doing a lot of the engagement. But it really is important to us that we engage with this network, because we cannot create the products from the data that we're generating unless we know what is needed by the community, whether that's local, state, federal, and even international. So I'm going to give a little bit of a random walk through our portfolio. Many of you may be aware of the very large high-frequency radar network that we have. It is the largest in the world. If you combine California and Northern California, we have over 64 radar, and these give us the real-time surface current measurements that feed into just myriad models and real-time systems, as well as science process studies. We work pretty closely with U.S. Coast Guard to ensure that these data go into real time and are assimilated into the SAROPS short-term prediction system. We also, for search and rescue, we work with California oil spill response, so that's CalOSPR as well as federal, to make sure that these are also assimilated into NOAA. When there's an oil spill, we worked pretty intensely on the Huntington spill when that happened to make sure that while those systems were in place already, there was actually quite a lot that needed to be done to fill in the gaps where there were no wind data. And we were able to not only back calculate wind from radar, which is used for the surface currents, but also deploy other instruments that we had, like the wave glider, to get out there and fill some of the gaps that were crucial in that instance. And that's what you're seeing here on the left, where this eddy was kind of was resolved by the radar. And it was important to show why the patch of oil in that event was not moving into San Diego. Everyone was kind of waiting for it, and it wasn't happening, in part because it was being kind of held and sequestered just north of San Diego County by this eddy that, once the winds picked up, kind of broke down and the oil moved. But we work really closely with Coast Guard. We also have, a number of stakeholders within the marine ecology community, because, as you can imagine, these data are essential for looking at larval connectivity, doing a lot of Lagrangian particle tracking of all of the biological particles that are basically at the whims of the currents. And then we have the California Underwater Glider Network, and this is primarily run by Dan Rudnick here at Scripps, where he builds these spray gliders in-house. We heard a lot about Slocum gliders earlier. This is a homegrown technology. These spray gliders are now quite ubiquitous worldwide. He works with a number of partners, including groups like SOSIB in the Mediterranean, and does a lot of the end-to-end work from the engineering all the way to the data management, and then does pass some of that off onto us. But we We really are lucky to work with him on the products that are generated, like this Hufmuller diagram here, which is giving you a sense of what is the state of the ecosystem here in Southern California from these operational subsurface gliders telling us heat content, and what does that look like over time when we have something like a massive marine heat wave like the Pacific Worm Anomaly, or the blob as we like to call it, passing through the system and then leaving its mark for years and years and years. So there was kind of this sense that it came and went, I think, in a lot of the media, but these things don't come and go, and they do tend to kind of shift us into a slightly new regime. We look at our connectivity with what's happening at the equatorial Pacific in relation to things like El Nino. What is happening in Southern California with respect to the temperature and the variability at the equator? Well, prior to that marine heat wave, so prior to 2014, you can see the tight coupling of all of the glider line temperature time series with what's happening with the oceanic Nino index, a real decoupling during the marine heat wave, and then those things merge back together again. But it took a while for that to happen, and there was almost a new regime that was set for many years prior, and we're starting to see them coalesce, but at an offset now that we didn't have. So without this kind of glider time series, we wouldn't be able to inform models that need this kind of subsurface heat content. And when I talk about these models, these are used heavily by Southwest Fisheries Science Center, Environmental Research Division, to think about how to forecast myriad fisheries populations in the face of things like the low frequency variability that is so important for California current studies. We also work within this space of coastal resilience and flooding and inundation with the California Coastal Flood Network. So this is a tight collaboration with Mark Merrifield and colleagues here at SCCOOS to think about total water. So really think about run up, run off, sea level rise, the combination of those at the beach level. We're working with municipalities up and down the coast, starting with a very old and I would say kind of foundational collaboration with Imperial Beach, where some of the initial investment in the high frequency radar came from Imperial Beach and it kind of established SCCOOS for what it is many decades ago. And that investment and that relationship endures, but now more focused on thinking about inundation in Imperial Beach. How do we take that model of our daily forecasts, push that up to every single beach in California? We can produce these forecasts of inundation, but the validation and then calibrating that coastal model takes more on the ground effort, which requires this myriad of sensors and even LiDAR that you're seeing on the left. And so we're kind of slowly working our way up the coast with this level of inquiry so that we can validate the kind of map that you're seeing on the right. And this is essential for road and parking lot flooding. So we go to the lifeguard meetings and kind of engage with them. They're highly interested in this for the obvious reasons. You heard a little bit from Carl earlier about the coastal ocean modeling testbed. We are engaged in that through an IUCE West Coast COMT, as we like to call it. And this one is about evaluating a real-time data assimilative model. It's a ROMS-based, called the West Coast Ocean Forecast System, WCOFS. This is now an operational product at NOAA. But for a long time, we were supporting and still do support a lot of academic models coming out of our various institutions that are ROMS-based. And we're kind of transitioning into this space of, if we're going to have WCOFS in existence, and it does and will supplant some of these other models, what are the ramifications for the ecological forecasts that we already have in place that are crucial for our communities when it comes to ocean acidification and hypoxia and harmful algal blooms? And so the one on the right is one near and dear to my heart because I've worked on this for decades, getting spatially explicit probabilistic maps that go out 3 days or more of toxins in the water. In this particular case, it's domoic acid because that is a very important neurotoxin for our region, important for fisheries, important for Dungeness crab, important for the marine mammal populations. As well as us, we want to stay alive too. And so we've done a lot in this space. I won't go into too much detail, but I want to point out that we have a California HAB bulletin. This is a public listserv, goes out monthly, pulls together all of the HAB monitoring that we're doing, that the state is doing, some federal labs, marine mammal rescue groups, combines it with the model output and gives it a translation. So in the end, what we have found is that handing these models off to something like Coast Watch is not the end of the line. the translation and synthesis really is critical. And so we're not doing this with every one of our products. I would love to have the time because we pull this together ourselves, but to have the time to sit down and explain the interconnection and the story and the narrative for what each one of these data sets means relative to one another is really important for our stakeholders to calibrate the model, because they can look at something like 60% probability of a toxin, but it means nothing to them until they know what that means relative to the resource of interest that they care about, just like a weather model for us. And we're putting in these imaging flow cytobots. We have 12 of them now. That's the biggest network of these in the world. They're robotic microscopes, and they tell us in real time, every 30 minutes, the entire phytoplankton community, they give us the images. We do the machine learning to tell us what those images are. And then we're putting this into a national repository with all the interoperability that you can imagine, and also the struggles that go with that. But I'm going to close out. We've got 2 more slides. This is the integrated ocean observing system sort of approach to thinking about MPAs. SCCOOS and SCCOOS came together and applied for this funding from California Ocean Protection Council. I should note they also funded half of that imaging flow cytobot network. And what we're seeing here is that we've got incredible inventory and catalog of models and data, and we can work with the marine ecologists in California to pull all their data off their desktops and create tools that are of real value for the assessment, ongoing decadal assessment of the California MPA network. Are these marine protected areas doing what they're supposed to be doing? If you want to make those assessments, you need a lot of contextual data, a lot of baseline data. And so we've put together these tools, and we're continuing to push the boundary on what those tools can do. And it includes climate projections, and it includes a lot of real-time data. So I'm not going to go into this red tide because we don't have a lot of time, but I think this gets to the outreach part of this. We had a really big event that happened right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was hard to get the sensors out there. You heard about wire walkers earlier. That's some really cool wire walker data that we've moved mountains to get at the time that this happened. But we captured this really pretty historic event, a 2-month-long red tide of a dinoflagellate. Had kind of devastating to the marine ecosystem. We had a lot of marine animal mortality, inverts, finfish. And this became, has and still is a major event for us for outreach in terms of getting some of these data into the hands of teachers in the community to tell these narratives, but also even work with groups like NASA Develop, which we've done to push forward the remote sensing component of this story. And that is a really cool program, if you don't know about it, that brings together undergrads over 2 or 3 month long period to answer really important societal questions. So this was my last slide. It goes into depth here. These are beautiful events, bioluminescence, et cetera, but they also can have devastating consequences. And I would love to talk more about diversity work that we're doing, but we don't have time. So I'm going to leave it there with this beautiful picture of Scripps Pier and this Lingulodinium bloom from 2020. And I'll take questions later, I guess, once we're on the panel. Exactly.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. Our next speaker, John Garlasco, account executive from Jupiter Intel. Come on up. Even I might be able to make this thing work.
Not the most technologically advanced, so forget that up. The afternoon event, very exciting. Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here today. First, I have to do a shameless plug for San Diego Green Drinks. So I volunteer with the environmental group based here in San Diego. For anyone that's local, we usually meet on the 3rd Thursday of every month and have some beers and discuss an environmental topic. But why I'm actually here today is to discuss climate risk. So by way of background, John Garlasco, and I'm account executive here at Jupiter. For those of you that don't know, account executive is slang for sales. So it's how we usually do our outbound messaging when we're spamming people. The sales logo on the bottom doesn't allow for people to respond as fast. But one of the real reasons I joined Jupiter Intelligence and what we do is we quantify climate risk across the globe. So we try to standardize processes for more of the commercial sector, also working with the public sector to quantify the short-term and long-term impacts related to climate change. Well, the real reason I joined Jupiter is really the caliber of the science and scientists. So based in San Mateo, we raised about $100 million And then initial capital allocation, we focused predominantly on the science. So some of my esteemed colleagues that I really get to brag about on a consistent basis and builds credibility to our organization is, first off is Betsy Weatherhead. So she's a Nobel laureate for her work on the IPCC. Just recently came back from a stint at the White House working on the National Climate Assessment. Pat Harr was a senior executive at the National Science Foundation Atmospheric Research Division. He's also our expert on hurricanes and cyclones. Alan Bloomberg is an oceanographer, predominantly on our coastal flooding methodology. And then our chief science officer is a San Diego native, but came from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So these colleagues utilize the global climate models, and then really what our secret sauce is downscaling that information down to a 90-meter resolution. So this is a high-level overview of what we do. So Jupiter operationalizes the best client science and converts that information to economic impacts. So we utilize the phrasing peril metrics, which comes from the insurance industry, thinking of things like flood, wildfire, wind, extreme cold, and heat events. And then what we do is a comprehensive portfolio analysis for locations around the world. So any corporation that wants to understand the complexities of their assets, we're able to run it through what we call as our Climate Score Global tool, and then run that down to a 90-meter resolution. We operate in 3 planning scenarios. I know someone mentioned the Paris Accord earlier, which is at 1.5 degree. From our perspective, we see it more as a 1.8 degree scenario. We also do the 2.7 degree scenario with the shared socioeconomic pathways, and then the business as usual, which would be that 4.4 degree scenario. So running that through all of the peril metrics, you're really able to understand comprehensively what your threat profile would be, and then how you can integrate those resiliency decisions. We do this in 5-year increments all the way to 2100. So this is some of the sectors we work in: insurance, banking, real estate, asset management. Going to get to our clients in a moment, but that's how we really identify the overall risk profile across different verticals. My focus area predominantly is on the West Coast in Canada, but transitioning more to the energy and real estate in the coming new year. So who does Jupiter work with? So during the initial foundation of our organization, we were predominantly focused on clients that had capital intensive projects, specifically the utility sector. So Hawaiian Electric, BP. Then as we grew the organization and focused on scaling more of the business, we transitioned into financial services, public sector, working with organizations like Broward County on flood maps, and then the distribution, which is where I really like to emphasize our collaboration with organizations, civil engineering firms like AECOM, BCG and Bain, more for organizations in the financial services. So thinking credit risk, the officer, the comptroller of the currency, the OCC right now is requiring 6 big banks to go through a climate stress test to test their liquidity. And then organizations like Guidehouse. The one that's not publicly named that I really like to emphasize when discussing Jupiter is a large investment bank that we actually evaluate their mortgage book to see what their risk profile is from climate related risk. So if you're looking at a 30-year risk premium, is that large enough for if capital reserves became an issue? So what do we need to run through Climate Score Global to evaluate assets? Ideally, we like to have the latitude, longitude. We don't do an Antarctica. I haven't come across any organization that wants to do that so far. And then the financial value of the asset. And the reason we need the financial value of the asset is we utilize the HAZAS model from FEMA to convert that information to economic loss. So should a 1 in 500 year flood event occur, a 1 in 500 year wind event, we're able to take that information and looking at previous insurance claims, convert that information to economic loss, whether it being damage to the asset or loss of building inventory. So we run that through our climate materiality assessment, which you'll see in a moment. And then further down is that vulnerability and loss estimation. So as you can see here, we're looking at, it looks like a lot of assets across an energy data set. So on the top right, we're looking at the portfolio summary, different types of assets across the world, where now we have in the middle of the peril metrics. So intuitively, like a street light, there's peril metrics, red is bad, green is good. And then on the left, you're able to decide between different scenarios. So referring to that earlier, that optimistic 1.8 degree scenario, the less optimistic, that 2.7 degree scenario, and then the more scary 4.4 degree scenario. As you change it in 5-year increments, you're able to see that threat profile either expand or reduce, contingent on the peril metric. And then you could break it apart based on whether it be fuel type, asset owner, really have a diverse way to ingest this information and make more strategic resiliency decisions. Now, as we do a deep dive into an individual peril metric, what we're looking at here is a 1 in 200-year flood event under the business as usual scenario, that 4.4 degree scenario, looking at the year 2020. So this specific use case was a utility that invested a significant amount of money in their asset. And should this event occur, what our forecast would say is that 2 meters of flooding would occur in the Southeast. Should you take the opportunity to allocate capital to build maybe like a seawall or sea level, our data set would be able to provide that offset. So we'd expect 0 at the end of it, which gives organizations the opportunity to really understand the overall financial impact of reducing the resiliency or reducing the impact. But that is Jupiter at a high level. I'd love to answer any questions after this. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next up, Carlos Gaitan. Did I say that right? Excellent. Let's see if my advanced file management. Have to see the mouse. Which one of those two is yours? Benchmark Labs? Take it away.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Carlos Gaitan, CEO and co-founder of Benchmark Labs. We are a software as a service company based in San Diego. Before we were in the Bay Area. Greetings to our colleagues there of Jupiter in San Mateo. We decided to move to San Diego in many reasons, because we believe on the strong ecosystem that we have and to give opportunities to the great number of graduates in the biological sciences, physical sciences, machine learning and engineering that the region provides. Benchmark Labs, in a nutshell, what we do is environmental forecasting tailored to specific IoT sensors. An IoT sensor is an Internet of Things device. It could be an anemometer, a pyranometer measuring solar radiation, could be thermometers, you name it. So we identified, based on my previous experience working at GFDL and with different users at the National Weather Service, that there is a significant group of users where the information from the National Weather Services, NOAA, NASA, European Center of Medium Weather Range Forecast, Environment Canada, the gridded models are just not accurate enough, because they are interested in subgrid processes that are often not resolved by those models. And they need to manage, as they mentioned in insurance, assets. We work on refining the publicly available information from, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. Thank you, US. We use information from leading numerical weather models. We refine them, and we use these IoT sensors as ground truth. As we are now in a panel focusing on the value of observations, and here in San Diego, in this great campus, I wanted to give you not necessarily the sales pitch of what we do, but also all the avenues that in situ observations can help to validate. We are Benchmark Labs in many ways, because we also believe in the value of transparent science, benchmarking against public and private sources. And in a nutshell, I just wanted to show you what we're focused on. So in general, Benchmark Labs is focusing now on the agricultural energy sector. In reality, why we are doing this is because weather affects all of us. However, for users in agriculture, from frost prevention, water and energy balance, labor scheduling, pest and disease control and modeling, and even costly access to insurance. All of them are affected by weather processes. However, because of what they call the spatial basis risk, there are many uncertainties when they try to get information from the nearest weather station that often is at an airport or at a location that is not the farm or the asset that they are managing. Those inefficiencies get translated into overwatering, pesticides waste, fertilizer waste, OSHA regulations, and lack of compliance for exposure of labor over hazardous conditions. It could be 95 degrees Fahrenheit, for example. Labor cannot be performed. And all of those situations occur at the more operational weather scale. So those are the problems that we are tracking. In terms of like the labs in our name, we are supporting, thanks to the Economic Development Council here in San Diego, a group of interns that have been hosted in our company in different areas, from business development to science and engineering. And I want to reiterate here that we are in Scripps. If you have like a very interesting postdocs or graduate students that want to transition into the private sector, but still play around with environmental data sets that have like an impact, we are welcome to receive them, and we receive support from San Diego Economic Development Council. In general, what you can see here is that there are many problems in ag. They are translated also to fisheries in many ways: food access, food utilization, safety, nutrients, climate-related perils. All of them can be improved with better observations. And sometimes this lack of in-situ observations are the ones that cause these uncertainties that propagate through the value chain. Typical problems that we had tackled in our domain from pest detection and classification. This comes from observations. They can be tackled using satellite data from NOAA, from NASA. Different hyperspectral bands. We are very interested in the novel technologies that are being released in the new generation of satellites that will allow us to get a better chlorophyll content and understand pests and disease before it's visible to the human eye. We know that it can be forecasted in advance, and this is a typical example of a classification model detected using machine learning and in-situ observations monitoring from a phone. Example here, knowledge discovery using genetic programming, exciting projects that interns had performed in the past. In this case, you can see how a data stream collected from one of the sensors and with a machine learning engine based on genetic programming starts to find the optimal nonlinear fitting to create a regression model that fits the data and can be used for forecasting. Another opportunity here is, for example, knowledge discovery. We had done it to replicate the open flow of Manning's equation, for example, just based on pure observations. We are in an observational based topic here. So I wanted to also showcase why it's important that we keep collecting observations. Not everything could be remote. Nothing can be modeled. There are so many areas that need to have observations. And when you have observations, there are like now machine learning algorithms, like in this case, this genetic programming equation that based on pure observations was capable of recreating Manning's flow equation that is highly nonlinear, just pure in observations, which is very interesting for new processes, parametrization models that are happening at subgrid scale that we know that are running in biological models at NOAA and NASA. I wanted to also showcase one study that we did also with Barbara Mulling, that is now here, that working at NOS Fisheries when I was at GFDL. Again, to showcase the value of observations, spatial disaggregation using regression trees, machine learning to improve salinity, temperature, and in this case, Vibrio forecasts to understand the exposure of these hazardous conditions. And that research can be translated into shorter timescales that are of interest of our constituency in benchmark labs. And I just want to finalize here by showcasing how our in-situ technology has real impact in day-to-day operations. This is a recent testimony that we got in ABC News in LA, where our machine learning-based forecasting, that corrects NOAA's environmental datasets, were used for farm managers here in Northern California, for avocado growers, to save 10% of water. This is the fourth year that we are here in San Diego suffering a drought, and we managed to save 10% of water, which is huge for California. We recently got a California Energy Commission grant award to improve our evapotranspiration forecasts based on that technology. But not only we save water, what is more important is that the farm manager was able to maximize their yield at their fields between 50 and 100%. So not only water reductions that we can go and discuss in terms of policy, the real cost of water, and if it should be that heavily subsidized in the state, but they saw basically a decrease on their inputs and an increase on their outputs. And that's why it's so exciting what we are building here. Again, I want to showcase our strong connection with San Diego. We were voted a San Diego Cool Company 2 years in a row. Thank you to the San Diego Economic Development Council, to the BlueTech Incubator, and to the World Trade Center that supported us for commercialization and export assistance. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. All right, Frederic Leroudier. Was that close? Frederic Leroudier?
Yeah.
De rien. All right. It's one of the only languages I can try. They let me control it. It's a bad idea. Almost. Which button here? Beyond my pay grade. Okay. Try not to take too long. We have to do some questions. Sure. So you have to only do for PDFs. You can only see it on that screen. So how does the advanced use the arrows? Okay.
Arrows. Okay. Hi. Thank you. And so I'm going to be talking today about how we at Bioceanor tackle the problem of climate change and how we contribute our technology and our expertise to a number of actors in the sector. Specifically on anything having to do with water quality, because that's really our focus as a company. As we know, the problem of climate change is actually, it exacerbates a lot of the problems that were faced by aquaculture farmers, environmental companies, and a lot of other actors out there, in that it puts more pressure on the environment and like I said, exacerbates those problems that were already present. Also, as we are growing, as for example, the domain of aquaculture is growing in importance. It's a relatively newcomer in the food industry worldwide. Those problems become more and more important and create also a kind of a problem on the environment as well. So it's a cyclic problem. What we're seeing is that there is a beginning of collection of data throughout the world, but also as the data becomes more and more available, it becomes more and more evident that the interpretation or the use of this data is not as clear or not as straightforward as it would seem, which leads to kind of a disillusionment on the use of this data. So how does one proceed in that case? The approach we've taken is basically to combine expertise in the domain of water quality, aquaculture, oceanography, marine biology on one side, and on the other side, data processing, which is kind of a unique combination of talents and expertise. Bioceanor is a company based in France, near the Mediterranean southeastern French coast. And what we've put together is a number of systems and algorithms and expertise tackled to the problem of exploiting the latest advances in those technologies to predict and offer services to the industry. We work with many different partners, in particular in the research academic. So IFREMER is kind of the equivalent, is a French government research institute for maritime studies. Also with water companies, water treatment and water companies throughout the world, in particular in France, of course. Sensor companies like In Situ, aerospace companies. We work in particular with CNES. They made it possible for us to do this presentation here. So we want to take this opportunity to thank them. Research institutes throughout the world, such as CSIRO in Australia and others around the world. What we've developed in many different phases is a number of systems. First of all, we developed an IoT system, Internet of Things, basically, which makes it possible to use sensors and basically to send all this data that's being collected on a real-time basis to the cloud. And in the cloud, we developed this tool, which we called AquaReal, which is a visualization platform that merges with our machine learning algorithms to provide not only visualization of the data, but also forecasting. Today, what we can do, for example, is to provide 48 hours advanced forecast for dissolved oxygen with an accuracy of typically 4 to 6%. We've demonstrated that in several different environments. For example, in southeastern France, again, in a part that was suffering from a lot of oxygen depletion, anoxia events. But also in the US here, Lake Erie is one example where we've demonstrated our ability to predict oxygen levels. As you know, this is a problem that's affecting a lot of areas today, oxygen levels. We've developed other systems to predict phenomena. So one of the ones that's also very popular these days is HABs, harmful algae blooms. It is a much more complex phenomenon, which is at the same time a higher challenge and also a bigger opportunity, because it allows us, with our expertise and the knowledge of machine learning algorithms, to develop the algorithms to predict those complex phenomena. So this is something that we are very actively involved with. Again, Lake Erie and southeastern France, but also in other environments, as I will explain. To do this, so I've talked about our IoT platform, but this is not the only thing that we use for data. We also use common public information that we can gather, for example, from NOAA sites, and also aerospace data. So it's becoming increasingly important, especially as we talk about HABs, to use satellite imagery, multispectral and hyperspectral data that's coming from those new satellites in order for us to be able to correlate that with the in situ information we're getting from the sensors, the network of sensors. We found, for example, in the case of harmful algae blooms, that you need to have a fairly dense and rich network of sensors, in addition to the satellite imagery that you can get in order to come up with a reliable forecast. Today, we are at around 60 to 70% accuracy on HABs in those areas I talked about, which is we think just the start of it, and we expect to get increasingly good results in the next few months and years. The way we interact with the different players is we've kind of separated that in different phases. Today, and that reflects a little bit the maturity of for example, the aquaculture industry. Like I said, this is something fairly new. Farming has been around for millennia. Aquaculture has been around for dozens of years, let's say. And similarly, the adoption of high-tech and digitalization is also more recent under the sea than on land. So the first area that we've looked at is typically shellfish, oysters, not to name it. There's a lot of that in France. Anybody that's been to Paris knows that when you go to a restaurant, there's a lot of oysters everywhere, which is good. And we've focused on that and developed. That's where we developed our networks of sensors and equipped those companies, those small farmers, with those sensors because they did not have that capability, and started to deploy it and get them the information that they are now using. So basically, it gives them a snapshot of what's going on underwater. Things like temperature, oxygen, pH level, salinity, they can get that at different levels, at different depth, as well as different locations throughout the environment. So those companies benefit from not only the availability of data, but also the expertise that Bioceanor provides. So for example, looking at the dashboard that we've implemented for them, we can tell them, hey, something is going on there. You should be doing lowering or taking your oysters out, moving them, and so on. Because they have a lot of experience, obviously, doing what they do, but they don't know how to even get the data or interpret it. So having this capability of centralizing the information in the cloud and using our expertise and our algorithms to help them and develop a more data-oriented strategy for managing their business, which is something completely new to them and very helpful. So that's kind of step one. Obviously, there is a step two. There's a step one. And now that's targeting the higher, literally, figuratively in the food chain, the bigger corporations, typically the salmon industry. That's a much bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And in this case, we're talking about companies that have already invested a lot in gathering data. So they don't need typically the sensors and the IoT equipment to gather the data, but they are sitting on gigabits, terabits of information that they really don't know how to exploit. So sure, they know that something is going on with the temperature or the oxygen levels or things like that, but they lack the digital and computer savviness required to interpret this data and make predictions or useful correlations. So typically, for example, when we talk about the salmon industry, it's very important for them to know what's going on in terms of oxygen, so as to optimize their feeding cycles. If you feed too much when the oxygen is too low, the fish won't eat because it's focused on getting oxygen. And therefore that results in a lot of waste and also mortality. And if you follow a little bit what's going on with the salmon industry, it's an industry that's more and more targeted by the environmental press in that they are wasteful, polluting. So nobody wants to have a salmon farm anymore near their house. So anything that improves their ability to operate efficiently and in an environmentally sound way is welcomed by them. Ironically, the one thing that the public loves about salmon companies is their use of high technology. So that's where we come in and are able to help them. So we work with a lot of those large companies, typically in Norway, Canada, Chile, and we see a lot of opportunities also developing there and the ability to help with creating a more sustainable aquaculture industry. We also work a lot with water companies in monitoring their activities and environmental impacts. Typically, that's controlling and monitoring and predicting pollution in the sea near where these companies operate. Also, we worked a lot with some of the water companies in the Great Lakes area because they also depend on being able to predict low oxygen events or waves of HEB, which happens now more and more regularly due to global warming. And being able to predict means they can take actions, better use their manpower or equipment to pump water, do things that they could do ahead of time, and results in a better operation and a lower environmental impact. So this is also an area where we see a lot of potential, and we've partnered with some of those companies that you see there, especially in France and around the world, in order to give them the best solution possible there. So I am the representative for North America, like the other speaker was saying. That means a sales guy also, which means that we are after conquering France, of course, now we'll turn our eyes to the new world. And especially, of course, Canada with the salmon industry, but the US, we have a few deployments already in Southeast, and we're looking for partners to help us do all these things that I mentioned here. And that's about it. Thank you.
My other panelists, could you come on up? I've somehow got to pull up questions in 1 minute. I'm going to take more than 1 minute. So, audience, you should know the drill. If you've got questions, raise your hand. If you don't, I'll make some.
Oh, 20 of us left.
81.
I'm Takashi Gojibori from Marine Open Innovation Institute at Shizuoka in Japan. Thank you so much for very significant and wonderful talks. I would like to ask all of you about data policy, particularly international data sharing. Actually, as you mentioned, the data acquisition will be very important. Also, data sharing could be important because no borderline on weather or like environment. But to obtain acquisition of data itself, very much costly and technology oriented. In the case of human genome information, I think a human genome sequence data shared internationally. Then digging out for disease-causing genes. But some countries are not disclosing the genome information because it's very, in terms of national security to some extent. But in the case of COVID-19, like SARS-CoV-2 genome sequence hugely accumulated, and under the initiative WHO, I think shared the sequence data, then the distributed, then I think as a human being, the digging out important information has been obtained. But in the case of those marine data, it's very important. Therefore, international sharing could be crucial, but still it will be related deeply to national security or like a costly, and also even spinning out or like a venture company may rely on those data. So therefore, I think in the kind of contradictory to protecting data or protecting like a new business models. On the other hand, sharing data is quite important. How do you consider the data policy internationally, or sharing or not sharing, particularly in the coming years? It will be quite crucial. I would like to know your comments.
Good. I can project my voice. Yeah. So in regards to that, so we are a for-profit business, but Jupiter has something called the Jupiter Promise, where we collaborate with nonprofits to satisfy that specific requirement, international cooperation. So right now we're working with the Nature Conservancy on a project based in Colombia, where we're providing the access to our data set for free to help them drive some resiliency for a project they're specifically working on.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's actually, as a small company, we rely a lot on getting data for free because we've seen how difficult it is to gather data and deploy equipment. When you get into hardware deployment, it becomes pretty gory, pretty fast. So availability of data is important for everyone. Now, as more and more sensors are deployed, the likelihood is that the data is going to become more and more heterogeneous, not the same as if it's provided by one government. So maybe one idea is, and to us, obviously, and I think for a lot of company, data is more important than money, is worth more than money. So at some point, maybe why not consider a marketplace for data, and with a sharing and exchange, and make it beneficial for companies to share data, mutually beneficial.
Now, there we go. Thank you. So as a federally funded program, we're absolutely committed and must be committed to fair data practices. We do everything open source, all of our code, all of our data. We ensure that it goes not only into these national data clearing houses, but into international data clearing houses. This is a commitment we make. We fully recognize that the private sector can then take those free data and add value. I think that conversations Carl and I have had, which is maybe not germane to this discussion, is just what is the return on investment from industry back to the private sector, where to the public sector, where these taxpayer dollars are ultimately fueling these industries. Separate conversation, I think. But I'm glad you brought up the Human Genome Project example, because one of the things we're doing with these robotic microscopes is trying to generate libraries of images that are publicly accessible to anyone in the world, to then slice and dice, create their own classifiers, their own machine learning algorithms, and that this would be interoperable with similar efforts going on in France and elsewhere, such that we get the power from the increase in size of these libraries, just like you do from the Human Genome Project, so that anybody can go in and start to understand whether you're interested in harmful algae or whether you're interested in creating just an incredible ecosystem model that is end-to-end with 1 million state variables. You can do all of that. And so these are the commitments we've made, but it's in part enforced because the federal government tells us it has to be. and I think that that's important.
Hi, yeah, great question. So from our perspective, in Benchmark Labs in particular, we give the option to each of our users to opt in if they want to share the data, or they want their data to be used to improve the forecast of their neighbors, let's say. However, we are cognizant that especially in the energy sector and in agricultural sector, the value of these unique data sets, it's almost something that they don't want to share, because in agriculture in particular, they believe on the value of the terroir. That's the unique characteristics that make their winery better than the neighbor, or like the notes, the intangibles of the fruits that make that wine have like a special note. In energy, on the other hand, some of the contracts explicitly say that their data cannot be used to help other companies, because of course there is leverage, and once they lose what is called the alpha, then they don't have any economic incentive to do it. However, we work also with non-for-profit organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and they very openly say, like, use our data, share our data, and help anybody that can benefit from these data sets. Another aspect that I think that's important to highlight is that not only is important to share data, but it's also to have a source that can quantify and qualify the data, because not necessarily because it's public, it means that you can trust the source of the data. And I had experienced that while doing forecasting for yield, especially in Asia. Some numbers are provided by the government, but do not necessarily reflect what the physics or the biology said that they should be producing in a specific region. So I think that that's an interesting level that needs to be also addressed, because you cannot necessarily start building models once you have the data.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We've got just these next two, and we've got to keep them somewhat brief so we can have a break.
So my question is directed to Clarissa. I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce up in the San Francisco Bay Area. But my question is relating to me as a kayaker and fisherman in the San Francisco Bay. We just had one of the worst algae blooms up there that I have seen in recent memory. And I was just amazed at how slow it was for people to assess what was going on, to telegraph what was going on. We had a huge fish die off, and then me, just through my interaction with the bay as a fisherman and a kayaker, saw all kinds of other terrible shellfish die off, shrimp die off, and there just seemed to be an ambivalence in the general community about it, and it lasted for quite some time. And then in terms of mitigation, what do we do about that? Building in resiliency in these kind of bodies of water that are heavily stressed and but valued. I mean, I know this is not your geographic jurisdiction, but I'm just like kind of outraged a little bit.
I mean, it used to be. A lot to be said here. That was a bloom of something called heterosigma. It's a type of flagellate. They do respond heavily to nutrient loading. However, that kind of flagellate has not bloomed like that in decades in San Francisco Bay. We deal with this kind of low frequency variability that makes it really hard to understand what a particular organism is responding to, a particular event at that event scale. Hard to connect that back to what's happening in terms of trends and how we mitigate that without the ability to have a really dynamic time series that would help you build a model that would help you mitigate through forecasts. Now, I will say in terms of the response, I'm not sure you're talking about this apathy. I know on the side of NOAA and on the side of the academics who were in the region, there wasn't apathy per se. They were pulling down the Sentinel-2 and 3 data from European Space Agency, really digging into following and mapping the progression of that bloom, looking at the very long time series of imaging flow cytobot and other water quality data that they have from the region to understand how anomalous it was. Now, on the side of the local jurisdictions and how they were responding, I can't say. I know that I personally got calls early on from water quality people about that bloom. So I know people were alarmed. I know they were trying to respond, but I think that there aren't a lot of things you can do post facto with a bloom like that in terms of mitigation. You can try to be prepared to clean up the beach. You can't stop the animals, prevent the animals from dying. It's a combination of factors, mostly hypoxia, because as that bloom degrades, the bacteria are degrading it. They're heterotrophic, they're respiring. And that's what we saw with the red tide here as well. So I get your concern. I think the problem we have facing us with harmful algal blooms is how unique each event is. There isn't always... it's hard to get, the theory behind it is tricky. Some of these things, we're kind of in an era of flagellate blooms right now, as opposed to, say, diatom blooms. This is highly connected to decadal cycles and the oceanography in the region. And some of this is, we have to realize, connected to natural oscillations that we have now with our long time series been seeing for decades as we move from eras of dinoflagellate blooms to eras of diatom blooms. And so it's an interesting thing to how do you take the secular rise in greenhouse gas emissions and overlay that with decadal oscillations in the environment? I think this is for all of us a struggle. But I appreciate your question. Did I answer that? Is there more I could say? I don't know about the apathy.
Maybe at the break.
We could. There's no model yet for heterosigma. It's too rare of an event. I mean, I showed you models for other ones, but that's because we know they're just constantly hammering us. With this one, it really did sneak up on everybody. Yeah.
Is yours quick?
That will be the last question. I'm Pierre Hervé, the chairman of the Biomarine Organization. We're working on some major seaweed project around the world. And
so I imagine you're familiar with the TNFD, which is coming out, Task Force on Natural Financial Disclosure and Nature Financial Disclosure, which aligns investors and regulatory requirements coming from TCFD, which is the Task Force on Financial Disclosure. But aligning with what you're saying, we are starting to see those specific requirements in the monetization of biodiversity. We don't hear them as often as you hear TCFD aligning with things like the EU taxonomy, the SEC regulations, but it does come up more in conversation, just at a high level from my business development work.
Thank you. So from our perspective. I think that it's important to understand the impact of biodiversity, and of course, we relate it with extreme weather events and what is happening now. The situation of monetizing it, of course, at the end depends on like who is your stakeholder, who is funding your project, and there are different ways that you can get support for those kind of initiatives. They can not necessarily come from the private sector. It could be government organizations, NGOs. We have worked with the World Bank. We have worked with international development organizations over the world, and those ones are also interested in understanding the value of ecological services, and biodiversity is key to understand how healthy an ecosystem is. We're talking about marine ecosystems or land ecosystems. That's a key component that you can find a way from different organizations, maybe that are not necessarily oriented on creating a venture-backed business that will scale to billions of dollars, but definitely you could definitely get funding to support those initiatives.
I only know this conversation from the perspective of protecting biodiversity, so I'm not 100% sure where to take this, except to say that all of the programs that we work with in the United States that are creating and procuring biodiversity data are all committed to making sure that those data go into repositories like OBIS, Ocean Biogeographic Information System. We try to give them the full treatment, which is things like Darwin Core and these fancy transformations that may or may not be useful to the private sector. But for us on the academic side, we get a lot of excitement thinking about how to transform data into other formats, and then just sort of leave it at that. And then we feel like, job done, check that box off. What happens to it afterwards is a whole nother set of questions. And I don't even know that we've even begun to ask those on our side at IUS.
Yeah, from our perspective, we've seen a number of those initiatives, private initiatives. So typically kelp forests, growing kelp forest, and using that to sequester carbon. And most of these efforts are just starting, and they're not they're just starting to think about data collection, even less what to do with the data and how to use it, how to make it useful for their purposes. So I think, the best answer we can give at this point is stay tuned. It's something that's probably going to develop over the next few years. And how to monetize that is also another question, another riddle that will need to be answered. But I trust that that will be the case soon.
I just want to add one extra comment to that question. I remember probably 5 years ago, things like that, there was some interest to look at the lesser prairie chicken in Oklahoma and Texas. I was at that time working at Princeton, and they asked me, can you help us with better forecasts for the nesting habitat of the lesser prairie chicken? It's very sensitive at 40 centimeters. So my academic mind said, of course we can do it, we are NOAA. The reality was that, of course, we produce only surface temperature or 2-meter temperature, 10-meter temperature, but not at 40 centimeters. But nevertheless, there was an interest to save that species. And they are we can go in a separate conversation and discuss why they are interested in saving those species. But that's a very clear way that biodiversity can be used for good, monitoring how healthy an ecosystem could be. And it could be for endangered act species here in the United States or globally. And also those kind of activities could prevent, for example, extraction activities in different ecosystems. So having awareness of how these species interact with the environment, depending on how protected they are, could determine the direction of many government decisions. And I will leave it there.
So I'm going to wrap up. I've got notes to try to cover the themes that we've talked about in this session, and the overall topic of reducing risk and increasing resilience and using environmental data solutions. I think we've definitely seen that on display. What happens to me in all of these discussions, specifically, I think around BlueTech Week, because we're bringing what Michael Jones likes to call the triple helix or the quadruple helix in terms of government, nonprofit, private sector, and academia together, is that there are greater challenges every day, and finding the solutions means it's a sort of an all hands on deck. And then the thing to figure out is how do we work together with our different ways of measuring success in this regard. And I don't have a clear answer to that, so I'm sending you to the network break to try to figure that out. And so, but I have, one of the answers is we keep having these discussions and don't be afraid of these questions and try to sort them out and identify where we can find the joint solutions together. So let's give our panelists a round of applause and thank them very much.